Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. So, since this is the March, the Women History Month, we decided to have last minute one gender talk after the other. So, this morning we will actually be seeing the Samyoga Sutta, so Anguttara Nikaya 751, and we will be talking about how attachment to gender identity comes into being. But before we start, we can pay homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Bhutam Dhammam Sangham Namasami. So since yesterday night we had a little Sangha panel on gender bender on a sutta, and we were mentioning this other sutta, the Samyoga Sutta, and I was suffering from insomnia last night, so I decided to translate it from Pali to English and make the most out of the sleepless time. So you will probably, if you go on Sutta Central, you'll probably find both Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation as well as Bhante Sujato's translation. And I will be reading from my translation, which is a little bit different. And so the sutta begins, monastics, I will teach you a Dhamma discourse on attachment and non-attachment. So here, attachment and non-attachment are the translation of Samyoga and Visamyoga. So Samyoga literally means tying together. So yoga being this, the yoke, so to speak, and Sam having that inclusiveness element. And Visamyoga basically means the opposite of that. So the separation from the attachment. So I believe that, if I remember correctly, Bhante Bodhi, maybe actually I can pick up the translation that he has. He translated this as union and disengagement, yeah. And I decided to just keep it as attachment and non-attachment. And then the sutta proceeds by saying, a woman, monastics, builds in the mind the internal woman faculty. So what has been translated as builds in the mind, which Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated as attends to, is a literal translation, literally of karati, manasi karati. So karati is literally means building something, constructing something. And manasi is the locative of the mind. So building in the mind, I think it's actually really appropriate in this sutta to literally give the sense that it's something that we're actually fabricating. And so woman monastics builds in the mind the internal woman faculty. Internal is ajatam, which could also be an adverb. So internally is another way that this can be translated. And itindriyam, so if we take it as an adjective, it's coordinated with itindriyam, which is basically the woman faculty. And I quite like the sort of connotation of us building in the mind our internal woman faculty. So something that we feel like belongs to us, that it's inside of us. And then this is described. And so the sutta proceeds by saying the behavior of a woman, and what is translated as behavior is kutta, which literally means made up. So something constructed, essentially. Then we have the deportment, that is a kappa, so a plus kappa. And kappa also has the meaning of something that is suitable, but also there's the sense of mental fabrication, speculation, imagination. So the deportment of a woman, the categorization, the categorization of a woman. Categorization is how I translated vida, which can also mean distinction, conceit, or as translated by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, the aspect. Or another sort of meaning is mode, manner, discrimination. I quite like the categorization because we somewhat, well, that's kind of like the biggest categorization that we have in human beings, right? Sort of women and men. So we build up in the mind this categorization of a woman. Then the interest of a woman. Interest is how I translated chanda. And then the sound of a woman, which can also, that's the translation of sara, which can also mean voice or tone. So essentially, whether we're talking like this or we're talking like this, what is the tone of a woman in our mind? And then lastly, the decoration of a woman. And decoration is the translation of alankaram, which literally means jewelry, adornment, anything that in this context, then in association with iti, we perceive as essentially feminine. And then she delights and finds pleasure in this. And delight is the translation of rajati, which comes from the root raj, which is hue, and is also related, obviously, to raga, passion, or what sometimes is translated also as lust. So something that literally colors our entire experience. And then the sutta continues, after delighting and finding pleasure in this, she builds in the mind the external man faculty. The behavior of a man, the deportment of a man, the categorization of a man, the interest of a man, the sound of a man, the decoration of a man. So essentially the same thing as before, but flipped outside, perceiving something outside of ourselves. She delights and finds pleasure in this. And then the sutta continues, after delighting and finding pleasure in this, she wishes for an external attachment. So there is the aspiration essentially for samyoga. So for what has been translated once again by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi as union with the external, with something that we perceive as external to us. It's quite interesting how pretty much the description of both the internal and the external are exactly the same. And the only thing that shifts is the determination of whether that is a woman or a man. And continues, she wishes for the happiness, sukha, and pleasure, somanasa, that arises based on the condition of this attachment. Monastics, beings who find pleasure in the state of a woman, become attached to men. In this way, monastics, a woman does not go beyond the state of a woman. And so here what has been translated as going beyond is the verb ativatati, which literally means also overcoming, conquering, transcending. And in other words, the Buddha is saying that kind of like this prison of gender is impeding us to attain nibbana, is impeding us to go beyond. And then the sutta continues, a man, monastics, builds in the mind the man faculty internally, the behavior of a man, the deportment of a man, the categorization of a man, the interest of a man, the sound of a man, the decoration of a man. He delights and finds pleasure in this. After delighting and finding pleasure in this, he builds in the mind the woman faculty externally, the behavior of a woman, the deportment of a woman, the categorization of a woman, the interest of a woman, the sound of a woman, the decoration of a woman. He delights and finds pleasure in this. After delighting and finding pleasure in this, he wishes for an external attachment. He wishes for the happiness and pleasure that arises based on the condition of this attachment. Monastics, beings who find pleasure in the state of a man, become attached to women. In this way, monastics, a man does not go beyond the state of a man. So essentially, whether you start by creating an identity of a woman or you start by creating an identity of a man, the process is exactly identical. And then the Buddha continues, in this way, monastics, there is attachment. And how monastics is there non-attachment? And the Buddha says, a woman, monastics, does not build in the mind the internal woman faculty, the behavior of a woman, the deportment of a woman, the categorization of a woman, the interest of a woman, the sound of a woman, the decoration of a woman. She does not delight and does not find pleasure in this. Not delighting and not finding pleasure in this. She does not build in the mind the external man faculty, the behavior of a man, the deportment of a man, and so on. Not delighting and not finding pleasure in this. She does not wish for an external attachment and does not wish for the happiness and pleasure that arise based on the condition of this attachment. Monastics, beings who do not find pleasure in the state of a woman, do not become attached to men. In this way, monastics, a woman goes beyond the state of a woman. And again, same for men, same exact thing. And the sutta ends with, in this way, monastics, there is non-attachment. Very simple, isn't it? Very, very, very simple. And yeah, it's very, very interesting, I have to say, how this sutta once again describes pretty much these terms, this terminology as woman and as man, with all these different aspects that are not specific, not concrete. They don't have an actual form, but they're all pretty constructed and pretty vague. We see that the Buddha actually never talks about anything in specificity of what essentially creates the identity of a woman and what creates the identity of a man, in the sense of like long hair or makeup or dressing in a particular way or colors, pink or blue or whatever it is, right? There's none of these specifics attributed to any of the two genders, but rather it's actually vague enough and specific enough in the sense that we see the universal quality of the process of gender identification that happens. And we see that, all of these essentially are not kind of so detailed, because when we see the history of humanity, so many things have changed, right? So all of this, whatever we perceive as womanly, as feminine, or as masculine, is something that is dependently arisen from culture, but also from time and place, right? So as we were talking about yesterday, at the time of the Buddha, for example, it was actually very common for both men and women to have really long hair. The reason actually why we have a shaved head as monastics was a statement that actually we were outside of the social hierarchy. We were outside of the caste system. The only people who had a shaved head were the people who were imprisoned, were the outcasts. So the Buddha had really long hair, no different than Banda Kapilani. So it was something that everybody was quite proud of and put a lot of care in. Similarly, makeup. It's not that, for example, or jewelry. It's not that it's something that, only women had to take the precepts of not wearing adornments of any kind, right? It actually applies to both genders. And we see actually, for example, in the 19th century, even in Europe, it was more close to drag queens, I would say, then, than to anything that we think about as masculinity today, right? So there was over-the-top makeup, over-the-top hair, and lots of different heels, and lots of things that today, in this day and age, in the West at least, we perceive as feminine qualities applied to males. Still today, actually, when we go to Asia, it was very interesting, actually, when all the problems, all the war started happening in Myanmar, that actually one of the ways that people were protesting were for men and women to switch sarongs. And to, the Western eye, actually, didn't seem like a big thing, right? They looked pretty much like dressed the same, but actually in that culture means quite a lot, right? That's masculine, that's like feminine, right? So you have to have a particular sort of accustomed eye to be able to tell the difference. And it's precisely through this process that we see described in the sutta that we render something that is neutral, an object that is neutral, we render it as gendered. And then the crazy thing is that we really believe in it. And we think that there is actually such a thing as something masculine or feminine that really describes who we are. Last night we were joking about the sixth aggregate that nobody talks about, the sixth khandha of gender. The 5 aggregates are not who we are, except for the sixth one. Sixth one really defines us. And really actually seems to be something that we all believe that is who we are. Everything is anatta except for that one. And so it's very, very fascinating how, in the sutta we see how essentially the Buddha talks about dependent origination when it comes to this big aspect of our experience. And so how do we transcend this process? How do we transcend it? And it's very simple. I feel like the Buddha gives us a really good encouragement to first identify how we are creating this attachment to begin with. How are we obsessing about things? How are we delighting and infatuating our mind with these aspects, and really identifying with them, analyzing them, looking at them, understanding them, and then creating the habit of not attaching to them and not holding on to them, not identifying with them, not engaging with them. And we stop obsessing with them. The late Rita Gras, that we also mentioned yesterday, who died actually when we started Buddhist Insights, 2016. She was a Buddhist practitioner, one of the disciples of Her Holiness Khandro Rinpoche, a Tibetan bhikshuni, who has a monastery in Nepal. She was also inviting, which I thought was really interesting. They have this really beautiful meditation practices in the Tibetan tradition of Vipassana practice, Mahamudra. The Mahamudra techniques are extremely fascinating on actually asking ourselves all these questions about the nature of the mind, to not necessarily find an answer, but really actually shed light on the fact that we have so many assumptions. We always talk about, the dogmas outside of ourselves, dogmatic religion, the dogma of here and there. But what are the actual assumptions and the dogmas that we have inside of ourselves? So one of the, for example, the questions that one brings up in Mahamudra meditation is, what shape is the mind? It's fascinating. Has anyone ever thought about that the mind could have a shape? Really bizarre. Why not? Why would the mind not have a shape? And is the mind inside of us or outside of us? I remember when I first
inside the body.
Inside of the body. Thank you, Bhante. Inside the body or outside of the body. Yeah, why why do we have the assumption that it's in one way or the other, right? We open our eyes and we actually have a bit of a more ample sort of perception, an ample view of our experience than just this this chunk of meat, right? So why would the mind not be over there? If we think that it's in here. And if we think it's over there, then why don't we think it's here or somewhere in between? So it's very fascinating. And anyway, she was encouraging us also to ask the question, what gender is the mind? Very interesting, right? Does the mind have a gender? And it's not, once again, to find the answer, yes, the mind is over there and it's male or female or whatever we want to describe it, and it has the form, the shape of a unicorn, but rather it's to really, once again, shed light on our assumptions, on our what we think that the mind is, what we think our experience is, what we think our identity is. And once we see how this is a total fabrication, it stops becoming that, that delicious raga. The fact that raga is this hue, that colors our experience. I think passion is actually a really good translation for it. As a former fan of the opera, actually still a little bit current fan of the opera, even though I don't listen to it anymore. But yeah, the opera, what is that? It's all like basically an exposition of raga, an exposition of passion. And we see the melodrama, right, of the opera. If anyone has gone, if you haven't, you should go. Especially, you can go on YouTube and Google Maria Callas, who was an incredible interpreter back in the 60s, 70s, 80s also. Yeah, of the passion through which, all of the sort of experiences, the human condition that we have, right? So like it's something that really, whoa, just takes on our entire experience. And yeah, I still remember actually when I had started practicing meditation, that at a certain point I was able to see how, for example, an emotion like anger would start building in me and kind of taking over my whole body and mind. Perhaps someone would say an unpleasant word, and maybe I was cooking, and someone would say something that I found extremely irritating, and all of a sudden there was this lightening that would, take over my entire experience. And through Dhamma practice, the more we become aware of this process, the more it's, it's a little bit of, how kind of like the burner becomes a little bit defective and you have to keep on going like to light it up. So that's a little bit how there's this passion. It doesn't want to light up anymore because we stop putting all the sort of the fuel, the different conditions that create such a big fire. And so there's slowly but surely this passion towards all things. And so this is in this way, through this process, we start, I think the more we understand how everything is dependently arisen, the more we stop falling into the trappings of all of these identities, and the more we start relinquishing them, we start not picking them up, and we start becoming dispassionate from them, and then it's very easy to transcend them. Well, very easy, I don't know. Easier maybe is rather is the more accurate, perhaps. And I think that's perhaps I think that's all that I would like to share for this morning. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the live chat, and we'll address them from there.
Dhamayang Dhammakataya Sadhukarang Namaste
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. And I just wanted to clarify one thing. When we talk about gender identity, we usually actually talk about it in the sort of, not here at Empty Cloud Monastery or in Buddhism per se, but outside of the monastery, usually it's spoken in terms of, all this thing that people who don't identify with their gender assigned at birth obsess about. But actually, I feel like this sutta points out precisely to the opposite, or how we are constantly obsessing about it since the moment that we're born. And if anything, actually, I would say that people who start questioning, as we were mentioning yesterday, also with Venerable Vimala, who's visiting Empty Cloud Monastery. I completely agree with you, Venerable, in the fact that actually if someone does not identify with their gender assigned at birth, I think they're already like a little bit further on the path, in the sense that they're actually questioning something that has been given. It's kind of like people say always, like, life is a gift. And I remember going to a Dhamma talk from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi many years ago, and someone said, yeah, life is a gift. And he was like, yeah, well, if life is a gift, can I return it to the sender? So I would say that that could also be that gift, that of that gender that has been assigned at birth, can we return it to the sender?
In relation to that, can you also expand a bit more on how, like, the distinction between sex and gender wasn't really like that we have nowadays. They wasn't really made in the time of the Buddha. It's always the same word. It's iti purisa. So could you say something about that also for people at home?
Yeah, thank you, Venerable, for mentioning that. I feel like mostly the differentiation, at least from my understanding, and I am far from an expert of the subject, but from my understanding of the suttas, once again, as Venerable Soma, the Arahat one, not the unenlightened Italian bhikkhuni that speaking right now, said, is pretty much, what does this womanhood have anything to do at all when the mind is focused and concentrated well? So pretty much the Dhamma is unrelated to any kind of condition that we have physical. Like the body is just the body, and I think we put way too much too much importance on the body to begin with, whether it's male, female, whether it's Asian or not Asian, whether it's, there's so many different declinations that always change. You go to Thailand, there's like a bunch of different stereotypes. You go to Taiwan, and for example, only Chinese people can be enlightened, really. Anyone else who's not born in that culture kind of has a bit of a problem in accordance to their view. So like, then you come to the West, and then there's all of a sudden, it's just, if you're a white male, then there's then you have all the right conditions for awakening. And so there seems to be an obsession with the body in general. And that obsession with the physicality of the body is very much conditioned, once again, by the history and the perceptions that are present in that culture. My understanding of the suttas is instead that, we're just talking about gender, and it's only present, the physicality that is usually associated with gender. So in terms of sex, rather than gender, is more present in the Vinaya, just for practical reasons. So obviously there are certain precepts that if we have particular type of genitalia are more relevant than the other. Or if we have the ability, for example, of procreating within our body, then obviously there is just it's just a function of the body, and so forth. But that's just relevant in a utilitarian sort of way, rather than in any kind of connection with the Dhamma. So I don't know if I answered that question. If you actually would like to, since you've studied, maybe you're more qualified to answer. We can do the question and answer.
It's a question that came up yesterday as well. I think it was one of the in the chat where people say, well, sex and gender are two different things, which is true. But in how we view this, but in the time of the Buddha, they didn't view. It was a very different society. They had very different these distinctions. Those two words didn't really apply in the same way as it is today. So that's basically what I was referring to.
Yeah, thank you for contributing that. Yeah, I feel like someone also actually had mentioned, I think I read it right before opening this, something along the lines of what we were talking about yesterday, as well as hormones influencing our experience of testosterone, essentially having a correlation towards aggressiveness and so forth. And I feel like, yes, I mean, there is, I remember also reading some studies of people who actually transition medically from when they're female assigned at birth, and then they take testosterone and transition to male. I was reading something very interesting that, for example, the sort of lust most often increases, aggressiveness increases, and so forth. So there's definitely, I mean, I'm no biologist, there's definitely those connections, but I would say that my understanding is, well, aside from having a lot of compassion for those who are assigned male at birth, because that must be really difficult to deal with all that testosterone, much karuna for all of you. But yeah, that, I think it's just, once again, it's dependently arisen. So there are certain conditions that then create certain feelings, certain vedana. And that also, when we have a body that predominantly functions on estrogen, when that estrogen also starts being, or there's other hormones that start becoming imbalanced to one degree or the other, there's kind of like similar emotional states. So it's just perhaps the time and place in which they manifested that is different. And regardless, I mean, I feel like the important thing is to really do the work of Vedanupasana, understanding that it's just feeling that arises, stays, and then passes away, and not take it too seriously. Really, actually, I feel like transitioning probably must be a really fascinating, actually, experience for a Buddhist practitioner, in the way that they can actually see the anatta of the Vedana, as opposed to if you actually are not transitioning at all, you kind of really believe, the PMSing, it's just not PMSing. It's like, I am crazy right now. I am extremely emotional right now. But instead, if there is a different type of experience, and then all of a sudden these hormones start creating a certain feeling that then creates a certain emotions in the mind, then we understand that it's there because of something that, pill that we're introducing or whatever it is, right? And it's very similar to actually my favorite Bhanteji's quote, which was, once again, once he started taking this medicine that had the side effect of anxiety, he started taking it because he's 95, and then he was like, oh, this is what anxiety is. All these people were constantly asking me how to deal with anxiety. And because he had never had the experience of anxiety, he never really quite understood what all these neurotic Westerners were talking about. And then once he started taking medicine that had the side effect, he was like, oh, this is anxiety. Oh, okay. This is how you could deal with it. But he wasn't identifying with the anxiety. Right. So he knew that was dependently arisen on those chemical compounds that he was introducing in the body. So it's very, very fascinating to do that process, and to a certain degree more difficult for anyone who has not transitioned. But, if Bhanteji did it, we can do it too. Yes, Linda.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment and a question. One of the things that struck me was early on when it basically, I think, was saying, if I understood correctly, by creating this identity, this happened to be a gender, then that creates external desire and attachment. If I heard that correctly at the beginning, and that just kind of struck me, that framework of just by creating this identity, then that creates the attachment for other, right? External, internal, and external, I think is what it said. And I just started thinking about that, even just more broadly than gender. But that's just one quick comment. But my question is, I'm curious if it can be known by any context around the sutta. Is it possible that this sutta is the Buddha saying this is no different than any other creation of identity in terms of its impact? Is that discernible?
Yeah, absolutely. This is how I take it. That's essentially every atta is dependently arisen, and realizing how it's dependently arisen is essentially the realization of anatta. So it can be anything: nationality, gender, race, you name it. Like, we have so many different ideas of what what things mean, and we really believe in them, and we attach to them, and we create a distinction between self and others. So they're so ridiculous. For myself, actually coming from a different continent, I see like all the attas of Americans, and I find them really surreal. But then, when I'm talking to Americans, then they're like, your attas are pretty surreal too. I mean, Americans are really more polite than Italians, so they're usually less they externalize it less than I do, probably. But sometimes I do see the faces like, okay, Ayya Soma is a little bit crazy. And that is actually very precious information to go and like, actually that's quite bizarre, like, for example, so the seriousness of how food in my culture is this like incredible sacrament, like just actually being in America with people that, on the other hand, it's just something utilitarian that you're working and you're eating, and it's not this like, oh, you have to sit down with your family and the food has to be in this way and not in this other way, and things like that. And I am the one making the Italian food. Like, there's so many things that whenever I actually talk about these things in Italy, everybody's like, oh yeah, but here everybody's like, that's really weird, right? Because you understand the sort of silliness of the atta. And so it's very easy to see the silliness of other people's attas, but it's very difficult to see our own attas. And we have countless of them. And that's, I think, what the Buddhist teachings really enable us to do, is to, start looking at them with new eyes and start saying, yeah, this is just something really silly that is creating a lot of dukkha, a lot of suffering. It's unreliable. And it creates all this distinction between myself and others, that it's not for my benefit, not for their benefit, and prevents me from transcending this big, massive dukkha.
Thank you. I had just one last related thing. Was it the purpose of this sutta, can we know, for the Buddha to say to them that gender is no different than any other thing? Like, is that part of his point? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I take it as this, absolutely. It's just one of the million attas. I mean, kind of like our identification card. There's like a lot of different attas. So once again, we tend to obsess so much with one of them. Maybe we talk about about one of them, but it's no different. Okay, and there are many friends. Hello to all of you. I see all of you, but I won't pronounce all of your names because you're too many. And Son of Apollon says, Is gender identity determined by the ratio of Purusha and Prakriti that an individual has within them? I'm not familiar with what Purusha and Prakriti is.
This might be getting into what I mentioned briefly yesterday about how in later Abhidhamma thought there came to be this idea that there's a male faculty and a female faculty within oneself at the time of birth, and this determines
The
one's
sixth
sex and
aggregate.
so on. Yeah, so
Okay.
that might be what they're referring to.
Right. So sorry, son of Apollon, but the Abhidhamma has never and probably will never be my forte or my weaker. Like, it's just kind of, I don't really go there. Thank you. Christina says, when strong emotions, pleasant or unpleasant, appear in my mind, I mentally say, this is not mine, it's not me, not myself. Is doing this helps in process of the gradual training of the mind? Yes and no, I would say, in the sense that it depends on really what you're doing. I mean, I remember actually the first time I heard that teaching, because I used to have stronger emotions. I still have strong emotions, but back then were stronger. And so I was like, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am. And yeah, then it became even more me, more mine, and definitely who I was. So that, I feel like it's probably kind of bypassing our emotions. So where we have that kind of intellectual attitude towards our experience, which is not exactly, we're not trying to outsmart ourselves, so to speak, but rather we're trying to understand ourselves. So that's also my understanding, actually, of the word that they use in the Tibetan tradition for meditation, gom. If I remember correctly, means to familiarize oneself with the mind. And I really like it. I find it very helpful, because through meditation practice, for the first time, we really start getting familiar with our minds, rather than kind of following and just being very confused about our experience altogether. And we're just like, okay, this is what's happening. Like, for example, if you're angry and you start meditating, you're like, oh, wow, this is what anger is. I mean, unless you're just going like, oh, I'm angry because that person, I hate that person, blah, 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 blah. Then that's just papancha. But if you actually start really looking at the experience of anger or irritation, you're like, oh, you're familiarizing yourself with it. You're like, oh, this is the flavor of it, right? No different than trying Jamaican food the first time. You're like, well, very interesting flavor. Oh, like, pretty good, huh? Or pretty bad, depending on what kind of reaction we have. I like Jamaican food, so pretty good was the first thought that appeared in the mind, right? But we start, those are different flavors, and then we have it again. We're like, oh, this is Jamaican food. This is different from Mexican food, or whatever it is, right? And then if we get very familiar with Mexican food, we're like, oh, this is, from Guadalajara, and this one is instead from Oaxaca, and this one instead is from Cancun or whatever, right? So we start distinguishing more and more and more. And so that's when I think we can start seeing the process of how also these emotions come into being, how they stay for a while and how they fade away, and how, whether we like it or not, once they are there, we can't do anything about it. They don't belong to us. When anger is present in the mind, actually the most we can accomplish is incrementing the anger. If we're like, oh, I hate you, I don't like it, then it increases. But just wanting it to disappear with the power of disappearance is just as, you look at the pain in your body and you want it to magically disappear in that moment. It's just not, it doesn't belong to you. It's not for you to decide. There's no ownership. And so once we stop clinging to it and trying to control it in the sense of wanting it to be in one shape or form, paradoxically, that's when it stops having its momentum and disappears, and it stops controlling us. And we start understanding, this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am. So we get dispassionate about it, and we turn away from it, and it stops ruling our life. And the next time that that same experience happens in the mind, we understand that, once again, it's not who we are. And also we understand how predictable certain situations are. You know, when we start going, oh, when these conditions are in place, then this result comes into being. You know, when I open this book and read that sentence, this emotion appears in the mind. Or when I'm about to give a talk and there are like a bunch of people looking at me, staring at me, then I'll have this sensation in the throat that will go like, right? And, you know, the first time that happened, I was like, oh my God, please disappear, right? And of course it increased, and there's sweat, etc. Now I'm like, oh, okay, of course, now there's everybody here, lay people, and also the Sangha. Okay, of course, when these conditions are in place, this emotion comes into being, and it stops becoming bigger. It stops becoming such big of a deal. We just understand, oh, when I turn the lights on, when I pull the switch, the lights turn on. Like, it's something impersonal. Anyway, so that was long story, extra long. Hope that was helpful. And Amaranta Sand says, gender identity is a very difficult task to transcend. What practice do you recommend to lay people, like be neutral in makeup or clothes? Well, actually, yes, the 8 precepts. I mean, we don't have to we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is the greatest thing about Buddhism, is just that we just need to, you know, spin it, turn it. So yeah, relying on the precepts, relying on the forms that we find preserved in the original texts, I think it's very useful. Studying, understanding, using these frameworks to contemplate the mind are very useful. We were talking about yesterday also for monastics, to the closer we are to the texts, the more actually we understand the purpose, you know, for example, why we have the same way of wearing the robes for men and women in Buddhism. And it's precisely to stop differentiating each other. Stop thinking that there is any difference between ourselves and others. So yeah, it's the same for lay people. Really, this is a practice for both monastics and lay people. So yeah, from time to time, take the 8 precepts, and yeah, stop obsessing too much with the outer appearance, and yeah, just we can start familiarizing ourselves more with the mental markup. And difference is spreading. Cute handle says, it's so interesting that the particularities are contingent conditioning. Some cultures, pink is masculine, and in others, pink is feminine. It also changes over time. High heels were originally high heels were originally male. When they became into Europe, you have French cut. Based on riding shoes used in Arabia, contemplating contingent nature of gender norms may help loosen the grip of gender identity. Yes, absolutely. To see, studying the history of fashion, which is actually why I was into fashion in my previous life within this life, was precisely because of this. It's actually a very interesting way to understand reality. It's actually an very reliable anthropological lens through which to understand many things, and not only gender. And he says, will there be a download for me to watch later? I'm in work currently. Yes, you can find everything always on our youtube.com/Buddhist Insights. That might turn into Empty Cloud to English maybe soon. We'll see if we get organized. And Difference is Spread and says, I find the contemplation of mind so helpful. Why we don't ascribe shape? Well, I haven't. The inner outer is fascinating, as all external perception has to occur. I'm inclined to say in the mind, but could say by the mind. Okay, that was a comment. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Kumu says, females also have the hormone testosterone in lesser quantities. This hormone has functions in the brain other than sexual in both sexes. Hormones fluctuate a lot in both sexes during a lifespan. Thank you, Kumu, who is an actual biologist, controls to Ayya Soma. So, yeah, for all biology questions, go to Kumu. And also says, Kumu adds, even from a genetically aspect, we cannot really divide people into simple male-female groups. There are XX males and XY females. We don't really know unless all 8 billions are tested genetically. Great. And whatever Slav says, does this event happen someplace else? Sounds like a tricky question. It both happens in this place and doesn't happen in this place. Many iterations. Anyway, that was the last question online. Does anyone have any other remark?
I had more of a reflection maybe that was related to maybe we could speak on it this time. Is that it seemed like the one of the things that Buddha was emphasizing that Linda pointed out as well was that in fixating on our own identity characteristics and signs of certain things that we associate with, like, okay, this is male and me, and so I focus on this, or this is feminine and I focus on this. It seems how the part of, I read this as the Buddha almost saying that it's actually that internal act is in many ways performative for the external.
Mm-hmm.
So like, oh, by dressing certain ways and identifying, building up this identity male, that builds the attachment to whatever male or female externally. And it seems like the Buddha is saying that that construction of that identity, it actually it's intimately connected with the passion for external things. And it seems like something that I've observed in general, that people who tend to, maybe it's in generalization, but people who tend to be very concerned with their gender, in terms of looking particular ways and acting particular ways, tend to be more interested in how other people, in wanting to have other people notice that and appreciate that and like attract other people. So it seems like the desire to have an identity, the Buddha seems to be saying that that desire is actually intimately related and inseparable from the desire to have that identity affirmed and united with other people that would match that identity in a corresponding way, whether it's male, female, or male, whatever. And I guess it seems like maybe the Buddha is encouraging, like what Amaranta said about, it seems like he's almost encouraging like a more androgynous perspective, which I guess could be dangerous depending on the type of gender identity that one has. But it seems like he's kind of saying, well, if you focus on your maleness, like, okay, these things, I have this, oh, look, like I look so masculine today, or oh, I look so feminine today, and like that. He's saying, well, actually, if you just drop both of those things and you kind of have this androgynous, like, I'm not paying attention to either, then that naturally, you won't really have any kind of desire for that. You're not creating an identity that needs to be affirmed by someone else. So it seems like the kind of any desire for relationship or romantic, or I guess more sexual lust, maybe he's also referring to this some way.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that, Ethan. Yeah, I would say my understanding is, I mean, absolutely what you said, but also like that any kind of essentially construct that we create, I am this, means that there is something different. So we create basically also an idea of internally and externally. And I feel like also the sort of term female and male here, it's kind of used arbitrarily in the sense of that just to create that sense of opposite, so that there's an opposite to male, which is female, which is not necessarily what we intend. Actually, maybe connected to what Venerable Vimala was saying, it's not necessarily connected with sex. It's not necessarily connected, oh, sex genitalia, female, then I create this identity of female, and then I'm looking for male sex genitalia, whatever, outside of myself, but rather the sense that there is something different and opposite. which is a construct to begin with, which I feel like then also fits in perfectly when it comes to homosexuality, for example. So being attracted to the opposite gender or the same gender, it doesn't really matter, but we're still attracted to someone that we think is different, that is outside of ourselves. And definitely it comes with obsessing about us having particular qualities and building that markup within ourselves. This is how I read it. And of course, obviously, then the biggest form of desire is a sort of instinctual desire that we have for procreating, just as animals. I mean, for, I would say, 99% of human beings, that's basically at least I see. I didn't have a particular this lifetime. Apparently I had worked on it, so I didn't have any kind of interest in creating a mini me, but that seems to be something that the majority of people like to do. So clearly that is the strongest form of desire. So I would say that obviously then in this process of identification, then there is the sort of conjoinment with whatever Vedana that brings towards what we call union then with the opposite sex and generating other little children and what sort. But I feel like here, I think that's, I mean, I really like this sutta because I take it to be precisely more on gender identity than anything else. Yes.
I had a question regarding, well, have noticed in the past that in the Jataka stories, often individuals who were male at the time of the Buddha in past lives, the stories that are told are about them also being male, and likewise for women, often the past lives that are described are there being women. So I wasn't sure is this something about like the patterns that we tend towards, like people who tend towards womanhood when they like for rebirth or when they're reborn tend towards similar patterns of womanhood, or is it because those were the stories the Buddha chose to tell because they would be more palatable to people at the time, or perhaps were they just the only ones that were preserved because it was more palatable to people at the time? Do you have any read on why that might be?
Yeah, thank you for that question, which I find actually those stories are some of the most uninspiring stories of the canon. Precisely for that reason. I was like, how is it possible that everybody is constantly, they also all are born, in India. They were in India. There's kind of like some consistencies there that are a little bit too consistent. Well, I'm no scholar, but my understanding is that most of the Jatakas are actually later, correct?
99%.
Yeah, 99%.
They're actually mostly pre-Buddhist, but then Buddhified with
Buddhified.
like characters that are put in.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I used to do during our winter retreats, I would, take one of the Nikayas and just read it cover to cover, like nonstop. And it was really great because it would have this like, basically I would brainwash myself. It's fantastic. I haven't done it yet this year. I'm really looking forward to it because all of a sudden, like you just have like brainwashing yourself and kind of having that in a good way, disclaimer. But you start having that flavor, that really strong flavor that then when you find Adama, when there's something that's really off with everything that you've brainwashed yourself with, you have a strong reaction. It's kind of like you go blue, 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 green. Wait, green. Right? So it's like a sort of instinctual way of relating to it. And that's normally, actually, that's like in the Majjhima Nikaya, there's that sutta, the Bakula Sutta. Precisely, that was exactly one of those moments where I was like, beautiful, I love it, love it, love it, love it. Then Bakula, like, the description of all the qualities of Bakula, that he's allegedly an arhat. And I was like, wow, it sounds like really bratty and self-centered. And, it's very much, it's like the qualities of Bakula is that he never helps his fellow monastics, sewing robes or doing, anything. You're like, what? And doesn't teach anyone. Of course, the bhikkhunis absolutely like not even thinks about it, but also the bhikkhus or someone, like no one, or the lay people. He hates the lay people. Like you're like, it's a little bit different from the descriptions of the arhats that I've found so far. So that's whenever we get into the past lives, usually of any of the practitioners, very, very different than what we find. Also, like in the Therigatha, I really quite love how the monastics speak about themselves, that there's hugely different flavor than how then we find, other people talking about them or their previous lives. And, actually Mahapajapati Gautami saying precisely that, in my past lives, I've been everything. I've been father, grandmother, son, daughter, sister, brother, like everything. So clearly there's an emphasis on the plurality of our past lives rather than this kind of consistent, boring sort of thing. And I feel like that was not really the point of the teachings of the Buddha to begin with, but rather it's something that still to this day, I mean, people really obsess. Like we have that library, like we have a section on women in Buddhism. There's a million different stories. Some that are actually from the Pali Canon, some that are pure fabrications of people from today, wanting really to, from a good place maybe, to have stories of practitioners from the time of the Buddha. But whether they're male or female, to me, it's kind of like besides the point. I feel like it's actually the beauty of the canon is precisely how actually, like Sariputta and Mahamoggallana are no different than Kema and Uppalavanna. Like also Palavanna is actually black, dark, and master of superpowers, no different than Mahamoggallana. It's just that we have preserved more the emphasis on the two male disciples of the Buddha, and we kind of have forgotten that. But really, the fact that they mirror each other is very much in line with this sutta. Like, who cares about the genitalia of Mahamoggallana and Uppalavanna? But rather the qualities of mind is what is really impressive. And yeah, so yeah. Okay. And I think that's all. Oh, yes, Denise.
This is just a comment, and I don't mean to. But this is very European white space. But listening to the whole description of the Buddha, where he says, that you're creating this female identity inside of you, etc. I find it interesting to take that and also look at how, especially in the West, a different female identity is superimposed on women of color, and how based on that women of color have also reacted and created, or not created, but noticed the sort of difference between a white woman and a black woman and the concepts around that. So for me, it would be something interesting to sort of explore. Obviously, I don't think anyone can offer any practical advice, but just wanted to say that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, actually, Denise. Yeah, but that's exactly, I think, very much in line with this sutta. So once again, there's not any kind of definition and specificity, but rather each one of us, whether it's cultural, I mean, my definition of being a woman has been mainly influenced by growing up in Italy So it's very different from the definition that perhaps can be in Holland, which can be very different from the definition that is in France, which is very different from the definition that is in England. So there's, and very different from the one in, well, not really different from the one in Mexico, but we're kind of more similar. But yeah, there are so many different connotations that come into being, in creating that identity. And when there is actually a place like the United States, for example, where there are so many mixed cultures that come into being, yeah, there's obviously all these clashes of identities, and whichever one is the superior sort of the predominant, the one with the most power, the voice that has the most power, then everybody, there's the expectation that everybody conforms to that particular identity.
One that's idealized.
Yeah, idealized, exactly. And so this is applicable pretty much everywhere. And we see also actually in the history of Buddhism with colonization as well, how that has influenced also the expectations that we have on women these days. And actually the last, specifically from my understanding, last 150 years have made the biggest difference in actually the expectations, for example. So the sort of ideas that how one is supposed to go to the temple based on their kind of like physical attributes. So they're all like, kind of imported. We tend to think, oh, in Asia they think this way, or there's that expectation, but it's actually like a very recent expectation, and it's something that comes from other places that went there, and they were like, you're holding your identity poorly. But it was the same also, when the Japanese went to, there's lots of books on that. Anyway, everybody has their own idea. Only this is true, everything else is wrong. And if they have enough power to exert their control on others, then they will try to do so, because that's basically the bias that one would have. Yeah, I would love to have that conversation. If actually you want to lead it, that would be super. Okay. All right. So maybe we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you this evening for monk chat.